quite importantly. Now I'm doing sort of mosaic career. I'm adjunct at Georgetown. I sit in Washington, D.C., so I'm teaching a business and climate change course to undergrads. And I fairly recently, I'm still onboarding at my undergrad, UC Davis. I'm on the Dean's Advisory Council for the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences. We're in the midst of interviewing for a new dean. And it's been really interesting to see how from different universities, these other deans, associate deans, are looking at climate change and how important it is for agriculture and environment. So it's been really interesting. That's me.
Sally and Gabby, can you introduce yourselves?
Hi, my name is Sally Aaron. I'm class of 2002, and I've been in the food industry for, I don't know, about 20 years. Mainly on the raw materials, food ingredients side. And I've just recently taken on a new role. I'm working with a macroalgae company startup, kind of playing in that climate space, playing in the kind of blue ocean economy space. And we're just figuring out our go-to-market plan. So excited to be here.
And Dr. Cora?
Hi, I'm Gabby. I'm an MD, MBA, Harvard GMP 35. My background is in psychiatry, but I've been trained in plant-based nutrition. So I have a heart for this and all the health benefits from it. Currently living in Miami, Florida, and I'm in a health tech startup, actually very interesting.
Great. All right. Ellen, I can't tell if Ellen or Antoinette are here in person or not. Okay, great. Let's see if there's anybody.
I'm sorry. This is Ellen Merrim. I'm in a car, so I was actually just telling you I couldn't get on, but I will for a second. I'm HBS class of 70. I spent most of my career in CPG companies, primarily food. I was the CEO of the Biscuit Company and the CEO of Tropicana. I spent some time in private equity, also in food businesses, more growth startup food businesses, chaired a couple of those. And I currently chair Newman's Own Inc., which is the food company that gives all of its profits to Newman's Own Foundation. And I've sat in on these chats for quite a while and find them absolutely fascinating. And I'm not going to say anything for the rest of the session.
Great. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. Actually, Tristan, are you able to introduce yourself, or are you?
Yes. Hi. How are you? I'm Tristan Patrick, HBS class of 91. And I went back to school, well, gosh, about 10 years ago now, and became a registered dietitian. So I have sort of a two-part interest in this topic, and I'm looking forward to today's session.
Great. All right, I am Cecile Seth. About 7 years ago, I founded Metabolic Multiplier with really the goal to explore effective lifestyle and metabolic health. I'm a alumni from class of 94. And what we do is we organize practitioners to see where there's consensus. And our next speaker is deeply respected by our 100+ volunteers for his intellectual leadership, his ability to educate and make really complex topics very accessible for those of us who have not had biochemistry, and also his personal integrity. Professor Ben Bikman's lab at Brigham Young focuses on obesity and metabolism, and his research focuses on molecular mechanisms, cellular function, insulin resistance, and the contrasting roles of insulin and ketones and mitochondrial function. He has a prodigious list of publications, and a measure of the importance of that is they're also very frequently cited. So it's my great honor that Professor Bikman, to introduce Professor Bikman. Go ahead, Dr. Bikman, and I'll give you the ability to share. Yeah, there you go.
Wonderful. Can you guys hear me okay and see the screen now? Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much for that invitation and introduction. I am delighted to be here as a penultimate professor. Nothing thrills me more than having a new crop of students to teach. And for the sake of time, I won't have any. I won't delay anymore. Let's just get right into the topic. By way of a brief background, my focus as a biomedical scientist has very much been in the metabolic realm in general, specifically within the realm of bioenergetics and a focus on the mitochondria and energy use. That has led me to focus more and more on fat cells, as well as the fact that my dissertation work was at a lab that was among the first funded labs to study the incretins and GLp1 in particular by Johnson & Johnson. So this is a field that I've kept my finger on the pulse of since the beginning, and I've looked with some amazement, frankly, at how much the interest in GLP-1 has just exploded. And so I'm happy to share some of my insight in that regard with you, and then answer some questions. So first of all, as a metabolic scientist, let's just address a question right up front that I'm asked often, which is the question of metabolic health. There are myriad ways we could define metabolic health. Even as I created this lecture, I was tempted to include some alternate definitions, including the fuel use in the body and the ability of the body to shift between sugars and fats as fuel. But I decided to stick with one and perhaps the most common definition of metabolic health, which is the absence of it, the metabolic syndrome. This is something we're all familiar with. Metabolic syndrome is this cluster of complications that really do tend to come together. Excessive fat storage at the central part of the body, elevated glucose or elevated blood pressure, or collectively what we can just call dyslipidemia. And this is a remarkably common problem. A survey that was conducted across the country in 2016 found that an estimated 88% of adults have at least one of these aspects of the metabolic syndrome, and possibly more. So a pretty sobering statistic that suggests that the vast majority of the adults in our country are somewhere on this spectrum of metabolic disarray. Now, as a point of interest, what we call the metabolic syndrome was first discovered by Gerald Reaven, and he, in one of its earlier iterations, referred to it as the insulin resistance syndrome. And this is very much my area of expertise through my dissertation and my postdoctoral work, and then the past 15 years where I've had my own lab. We just continue to focus on the etiology and the consequences of this disorder. Which is not only so common, but even beyond its prevalence is just how relevant it is. And the relevance goes well beyond the metabolic syndrome. Insulin resistance is one of the leading causes of some of the most debilitating, costly chronic diseases that we're struggling with worldwide. Whether it's heart disease, whether it's breast or prostate cancers, whether it's type 2 diabetes or the most common liver disorder, or fat cells growing too much, insulin resistance is a common cause of all of them. Even beyond these lethal killers and problems are some that are less lethal, but perhaps more heartbreaking, like infertility. The most common cause of infertility in women is PCOS. In men, it's erectile dysfunction. And despite their profound differences, one thing they share in common is that insulin resistance is often the leading contributor to each of these disorders, albeit in very, very different ways. In one instance, insulin affecting the ovary's ability to produce a proper amount of estrogens, and in the other, the insulin resistance affecting the ability of the endothelium to dilate. And then beyond this, we have other pathologies like migraine headaches, even certain forms of depression, Alzheimer's disease. We've published a couple papers on that topic now. But even though each of these disorders has distinct stimuli that are unlike, that it wouldn't share with any other disorder, what I believe is so relevant here is that they all do share one common noxious stimulus, namely insulin resistance. Thus, I think it is an important strategy medically to focus, to not only ensure we are mindful of measuring insulin resistance, which is a topic for another time, but also mindful of strategies to prevent and reverse it. And with that in mind, let's move to another question, which is, where does insulin resistance come from if this is such a common problem? And let me just emphasize, it's not an American problem. In fact, I just over the past month have given a version of this talk, albeit not specific to GLP-1, but in London and in Belgium and in Switzerland, and I'll be giving a talk in Oman and Dubai over the next 2 months. So this is not an American issue. And even I did my postdoctoral work at Duke Medical School, but in Singapore. Duke has a campus in Singapore, and Singapore actually has a higher prevalence than we have in the US. So this is not a domestic problem. It's very much global. So the question, where does it come from, is one that goes beyond our own borders. The most common cause, and this is, again, a topic that would be an entire lecture of its own. So I've made it as succinct as possible. The most common cause of insulin resistance is insulin itself. When insulin is chronically elevated, it drives insulin resistance. And I'm just sharing a handful of citations here, including some of my own. And this is, at first glance, it seems a little counterintuitive, but in fact, at second glance, it becomes a little more, well, intuitive, where too much of something, it's a fundamental biological principle, where too much of something causes a resistance to that something. This is a concept seen across all of biology. And with hormones and insulin in particular, we very much see that. Too much insulin drives insulin resistance. But is it common to have too much insulin? Indeed, it is. So this is what, let's look at just a moment, and I'm reproducing this just to fit my own aesthetics, but I'm exactly patterning my figure here over the data of this figure. It's funny for a guy who looks like me to be overly concerned with aesthetics, but I like things to look a particular way. Thankfully, my wife doesn't care as much as I do. Otherwise, I'd still be single. So what happens when a person eats pure fat, which is admittedly something we don't do too often, but if a human eats pure fat, there's no insulin response. And we're about to publish some of our own data on confirming this. When someone eats pure protein, there can be a little bit of a response, perhaps a little delayed. Very often, there's nothing beyond the realm that reaches statistical significance. Sometimes there is. When a human eats pure carbohydrate, which in the form of glucose, then there's a substantial effect where insulin will go up by 10 to 20 times. And even in an insulin-sensitive person where insulin is working well, and in this crowd, I think would be familiar enough with the fact that one of insulin's main actions is to bring blood glucose back down. So when insulin works well, even in that person, insulin will be elevated for up to 3 hours. That's a normal effect. But if we give that same amount of glucose to an insulin-resistant person, not only can the insulin go several times higher, but it can be elevated for up to 5 hours. So insulin responds most robustly to a glucose load. Now, is that a problem? It is only a problem insofar as globally, 71% of all the calories we eat come from carbohydrates. And unfortunately, not all carbohydrates are created equal, of course, when it comes to this effect. I need to make sure that's very, very clear. However, globally, most people are eating very refined starches and sugars. They're getting their carbs from bags and boxes with barcodes, which are going to be very rapidly digested, resulting in a very high glucose spike, resulting then in a high insulin spike. And then to put this in one final context, and this is, again, not just a problem here, this is very much a problem abroad as well. When we consider the impact of the macronutrients in light of the heavy, the predominant diet relying on carbohydrates, then when we look at the frequency of eating, the problem really becomes more apparent, where in the uncommon individual who only eats 3 times a day, their insulin levels are spiking like we might see here, where the person eats a starchy, sugary breakfast, and by the time the insulin's coming down, they may have an hour or so of insulin getting back to fasted levels. Then they've spiked it again. Maybe they'll have a moment or so when it's come down again. But again, this is the uncommon person, because as we know, most people are filling in all of these gaps. by snacking. So even in an insulin sensitive person whose insulin is coming down as quickly as possible, the person is still generally spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin. Now, at least half of adults worldwide are insulin resistant. And if we give them these same foods, insulin isn't even coming down a little, because by the time insulin would attempt to start coming down, the person has spiked it back up with the mid-morning snack. And by the time that's coming down, they've spiked it back up with their starchy, sugary lunch. So we can see that globally, the average person is spending not only every waking moment, but perhaps many of their sleeping moments in a state of elevated insulin. And this is driving insulin resistance. Too much insulin is the most relevant cause of insulin resistance. Thus, the solution starts to become somewhat simpler or simple and obvious, where if too much insulin is the cause of insulin resistance, the solution to prevent or reverse it just needs to be helping insulin come down. Now, there are a handful of strategies, but for the sake of picking the most impactful, I believe, based on the sum of all evidence, there are two primary strategies that someone could incorporate in order to improve insulin resistance very rapidly. And we've published some case reports working with a local clinic to confirm some of this. And of course, appreciate the fact that most of my teaching is to 20-year-olds. So not only do I beg your pardon for my somewhat cartoonish presentation style, but even my kind of use of mnemonics and alliteration to help the students remember. But the first rule would be control carbs. And then the second would be frequently fast. Now, I know that this first point, control carbs, can be met with some opposition. Let me just remind you guys that I'm not stating a person shouldn't eat any carbs, that it is important to appreciate the glycemic impact, that of course 100 grams of cruciferous vegetable is going to have a fantastically different effect, and indeed practically no effect, whereas 100 grams of a Snickers bar or the sugar from that is going to have a very, very different effect. And then fasting, of course, minute for minute, fasting is the fastest way to bring insulin down. However, these things aren't necessarily easy to do. While the concept is simple, the implementation is not, because especially when it comes to carbohydrates, we're dealing with true addictions. That there's no evidence that humans have an addiction to protein. There's no evidence that humans have an addiction to fat on its own. There is evidence to suggest addictive tendencies with refined starches and sugars. So the solution, of course, would be changing diet, but that can be very difficult and requires a lot of personal care and attention, which, for better or worse, is a difficult thing to do, even in the best of circumstances. And so often diet is excluded as an option. And then that gives rise to alternatives like medications in order to try to help, whether the person acknowledges it this way or not, to help their blood glucose get under control or control their consumption of refined starches and sugars, and to enable them to eat a little less frequently. And with these medications in mind, it brings us to the injectables, which is an area that is exploding in interest, unlike anything I have ever seen. I've never seen a class of drug go from being so obscure to so popular so quickly, even to the point that people brag about being on them. No one brags about being on erectile dysfunction medication. No one brags about being on antihypertensives or antidiabetics, but boy, they will brag about these incretins, even though they don't know what that means. So the incretins are a class of hormones that come from the gut that regulate metabolic function within the body. And this was what my PhD lab was focusing on, where we got the funding from Johnson & Johnson to originally study. But this is all based on the idea that the gut is a fantastically busy endocrine organ. I am fortunate enough to teach a graduate class in endocrinology, and I make a point of introducing the students very early on to the classic endocrine organs like the gonads or the thyroid gland or the adrenal gland. And then I tell them that essentially everything else in the body is also an endocrine organ. The bone makes hormones, the skin makes hormones, the heart makes hormones, and so too do the intestines. The intestines produce dozens of hormones that are within that family of incretin and not, but the most famous, of course, is GLp1. This is the one that has been leveraged the most with these injectable weight loss drugs. And for good reason, because GLp1 has a profound effect on slowing down the intestines. So it delays gastric emptying. So when someone eats something, normally that something will stay in the person's stomach for a handful of hours, maybe up to 4 or so hours. But with elevated GLP-1, like from these injectables, this has a much, much stronger effect. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So let's just stick with GLP-1 for now. What else can GLP-1 do that would have a metabolic benefit? It also can increase fat reliance or fat oxidation, so fat burning. And then also related to the gastric emptying, it has a central effect at the brain to stimulate satiety. So ultimately, very much helping the person do the 2 things that I'd mentioned a moment ago. They find it easier to fast and just generally control their cravings, and thus control their consumption of refined starches and sugars, those being the carbs that need to be controlled the most. And so with these benefits of GLP-1 in mind, as I've already alluded to, it's no surprise that drug manufacturers have attempted to really dial this up to an 11. You guys are familiar with that Spinal Tap video of the guitarist having the 11 on the dial, so this is what's happened here. They've taken the body's GLP-1 signal, this natural hormone that we produce, and they have mimicked the effect of the hormone and taken it up to a super physiological level, a level that we can't get to on our own. That's why I say that it's dialed it up to an 11. It's gone beyond the normal metrics here. Now, when these drugs first came out, and when I was first studying them, they're at the lower dose, which is even below the current Ozempic dose, Ozempic being the lower dose of these 2 with using the exact same molecule. Its primary mechanism of action was to inhibit glucagon. Now, glucagon is insulin's opposite. Whereas insulin wants to bring blood glucose down, glucagon, also being a product of the pancreas, wants to push blood glucose levels up. Now, neither is a hero or a villain. They're both part of this wonderful dynamic pursuit of homeostasis, keeping blood sugar levels in a normal range. However, one of GLP-1's effects is to inhibit glucagon, which in a diabetic population, type 1 or type 2, is profoundly relevant, because as much as we say that the person isn't making insulin in the case of type 1, or the insulin isn't working well, which is the case of type 2, a consequence of this is that they're chronically experiencing excess levels of glucagon, which is constantly pushing the glucose levels up. And so with GLP-1 bringing glucagon down, there is now this reduction in the upward pressure of the blood glucose levels that allows blood glucose levels to come down. And of course, as blood glucose levels come down, insulin comes down, and the person can become more insulin sensitive. So just to put that in the proper perspective, originally, these GLP-1 agonists or activators were just anti-diabetic drugs. And when they were in that realm, I generally gave them a pretty favorable view. I could sort of give one, maybe not 2 thumbs up, but 1 thumb up and say, yeah, it'll work. It'll help reduce blood glucose. But even at this lower dose, there was this finding that it also helped people stop snacking, and their cravings were getting better and the hunger was going down. Now, back to a point I was about to make a little prematurely a moment ago. This delayed gastric emptying is so substantial that within clinical practice, and there are clinicians here who could state this probably better than I could, when someone goes into surgery, they're expected to fast for a period of time in order to ensure that the stomach is empty, to help reduce the risk of them vomiting as a result of the nausea. However, what they found was that even after a 24-hour fast, if people were on these GLP-1 drugs, there was still food in their intestines. The stomach had slowed down so much that food was there multiples longer than it should have been. In fact, some people on these drugs experience these, what's cheekily called Ozempic burps, where they have so much food still sitting in their stomach so much longer than it should be that it starts to become a little putrid. And then they have this putrid gas coming up and they're burping, or they have very stinky breath. Now, with that stomach paralysis in mind, there are clinical reports of people who have responded, who have had this response be so strong that they have a full paralysis of their intestines, which can become something that is quite lethal quite quickly. So the slowing of the intestines just goes from a slow to a stop, which is very, very problematic. Now, somewhat related to all of this, and certainly the compromised the almost absence of any appetite, as well as the very compromised digestion because of the altered movement of the intestines, people become malnourished. And this paper published in the New England Journal, which is one of the preeminent biomedical journals, found that if you actually look at the nature of the weight loss, up to 40% of the weight that these people are losing is coming from lean mass. And I'm very appreciative of the fact that many of you listening, this is a female-heavy audience. I believe this is particularly relevant to women who will have a much harder time ever recovering that muscle and bone. Of course, the bone will be very difficult to recover, and muscle as well. So there's, I believe, a very relevant population here, but both male or female with age is going to have a very difficult time recovering that lean mass. And this matters because look at the rebound. When you look at the people who get off the drug, no surprise, this drug has given this very artificial control of food and eating habits. And you can see about 2 years later, they've gotten back to within 5 kilograms. Now, it's interesting to note that that is still an upward curve, that if they had continued this out for another several months, who knows how much closer it would have come to get right back to where they were. But this is such an important gap because of the two masses that were measured in that New England Journal paper, fat mass versus lean mass. For every 10 kilograms the person's losing, 4 kilograms is muscle and bone. One of those masses, fat mass or lean mass, will come back very easily. It's just one of the particular vicious natures of the human body. We can recover fat mass very, very quickly. And so as an actual percent body fat, it's very reasonable to expect that these people have actually a higher percent body fat than they did before they ever started the drug. Now, why does this matter? Within the United States, we see that up to 70% of people, the patients themselves will they want to get off the medication at 2 years in. They are so sick of feeling sick. When people say there's a better control of cravings, that's sort of a nice way of saying the person always feels a little nauseous. And people get tired of feeling nauseous. They get sick of feeling sick. And so it's no surprise that roughly 3/4 of all the patients on their own want to get off the medications. And then again, you know the consequences. They gain that weight back very, very quickly, and fat mass will recover very quickly, whereas lean mass may not recover at all. All right, now to the somewhat happy ending, because I've been telling a fairly scary, sobering story so far. Is it possible to get some of the benefits of GLP-1 without all of these negative side effects? As a reminder, this is something we make. We produce GLP-1 from our small intestine. Certain carbohydrates are capable of inducing a release of GLP-1. Proteins certainly are. Certain fats are. And then there are other things like yerba mate, and of course, one I'm going to mention in a moment. But this is a human study that I show here, and it's quite small. It's maybe too small that even squinting won't help. But interestingly, they were measuring GLP-1 response in humans. And this was with a baked potato consumed on its own or with certain fats. And it's interesting to note that the potato on its own had no effect on GLP-1. And it's also interesting to note that the animal and the fruit fats did elicit a substantial multifold increase in GLP-1, whereas the seed oil, the polyunsaturated fat, did not elicit such a response, that it was just the saturated and the monosaturated fats, these fats that humans have been eating since time immemorial, either from the animal or from just crushing a fruit, which required no technology really for our ancestors to do, whereas seed oils are much, much newer, of course, only being introduced in the human diet within roughly the last 100 years. What was once just a product of a machine oil or lubricant then found its way into the human diet. So some fats will elicit this effect, some won't. Some carbohydrates will, some won't. But this brings us to another carbohydrate, which is allulose. And these are my final thoughts here. So allulose is also an activator of GLP-1. It is a very, very close sibling to fructose, where you can see that it simply has an adjustment of the hydroxyl unit on this third carbon. So it's a very, very close relative to fructose, but this has a substantial effect. Not only does it give some of the sweetness of fructose, but it also becomes undigestible. So it's considered a low calorie, but basically 0 calorie molecule. But it's not a sweetener, despite what I mentioned. It's what's considered a rare sugar because it is found in nature from things like figs or corn. But because we don't metabolize it, it's not suitable for the metabolic process that fructose is. It's just excreted. Now, with regards to its GLP-1 effect, when allulose is compared to other simple sugars, you can see here in this little figure, it has the ability to increase GLP-1 secretion almost twofold. Well, indeed, ultimately more than twofold over any other sugar as time goes on, 12 hours or so. And this study found that it can be quite rapid with allulose, a 25-gram dose, which is a very reasonable amount, increases GLP-1 by about 60% or so within just 30 minutes. And this study suggests that it could continue. My lab just published a paper in the journal Nutrients, which is a very good journal. And we did a rat study, and rats appear to have a very similar enteroendocrine response as humans do to allulose. And we had different groups on a standard diet, a Western diet, and then each of those two dietary groups mixed with stevia or allulose. And very briefly, because I know these kinds of figures can become quite dull, both groups getting allulose had a significant increase, almost a twofold increase in GLP-1 levels in a fasted state. So this wasn't just after they were eating, but it was something that was lingering. And then also no surprise that when you give the animals the Western diet, which is high fat, high sugar, they gain the most weight and they eat a lot. But when they had allulose, they gained significantly less weight and ate significantly less. That's comparing the red lines to the light blue lines. And to a similar degree, we see results in humans where if you give humans allulose and sugar, you significantly bring down their blood glucose response. Here's the sugar, and then you can see it's about half. We blunt the glucose response by about half when it's eaten with this other sweet molecule, namely allulose. And where in Asia, in Japan, and in this case, Korea, where allulose has been used the longest and has had the longest approval, as it's a relatively newer molecule, just taking allulose in the absence of any other dietary changes was sufficient to actually shrink their central adiposity. And looking at squared centimeters here on this axis. So the high allulose group, which was still a pretty modest amount, just 2 doses of 7 grams daily, just taken orally, resulted in the greatest reduction in central adiposity. And again, important to note that they were just simply told, take a little bit of this sweet sugar and you don't have to change anything else. So pretty impactful when you're trying to deal with changing dietary habits. Now, there is more I could say, including some of the results clinically of a fellow who manages a clinic out east, well, in your neck of the woods, me being in the Mountain West, where he is doing similar interventions as we see here with this Korean study, where he's simply giving people allulose in the form of these little allulose kind of sugar packets and almost using it as like a prescription type thing, including helping people get off their GLP-1 medications. But for the sake of time, I've reached my 30 minutes and I want to wrap up, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about fat cells, insulin resistance, mitochondrial, bioenergetics, allulose, and anything else related. Thanks for listening, and I'll stop sharing.
That was fabulous, Dr. Bikman. So what I would like to do is take a few questions for Professor Bikman, and that before we move to our next speaker, and we'll move to the next speaker, and I'll introduce her, and then we'll also take a few minutes to introduce those people who have joined since. So does anyone have any questions specifically for Professor Bikman before we move on? Go ahead, Gina.
Yeah, please, guys, call me Ben.
Okay, Ben, that was absolutely fascinating. I don't have a background in biology or anything. Is it the indigestibility of allulose that is maybe responsible for most of what happens in the body overall. Because I mean, years ago, I remember it's like, oh, eat this sort of bread and you'll lose weight because it fills you up. And I think it was just like, it's so much cellulose, which you can't digest. So it just kind of sits in your stomach. Is this doing this maybe in a more subtle way, or is it something else?
Yeah.
The chemistry that does it.
Right. That's a great question. So allulose is absorbed. It actually uses the same transporters in the small intestine that fructose uses. And those transporters are variable in their expression. So it's not uncommon when someone first starts using allulose, they'll get a little bit of GI distress because they don't have enough of those transporters. But relatively quickly, especially based on the reports from this clinic that I just alluded to, those transporters start to upregulate, and then the person finds that they don't have any other further GI, bubbling, if you will. But we know it gets absorbed into the gut, into the blood rather, because you can measure it in the blood, and we know that you can measure it in the urine. So that is the main mechanism of excretion, and that may be actually one of the ways where we are about to publish a report, a case report documenting the rapid reversal of gout in people where uric acid can be a very sticky clinical marker and sometimes hard to move. Well, allulose appears, and it could be through an osmotic, where allulose is pulling the uric acid into the urine more readily, but it starts to improve uric acid levels fantastically quickly, even faster than some specific drugs like allopurinol. So to answer the question, we know it does get absorbed across the small intestine into the blood, and then we know that it has a very clear pathway of excretion through the urine. Cecile, you've quieted. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. Sally?
Yeah, one of the things I didn't say is I've worked in the world of high intensity sweeteners for a long, long time. So this is fascinating. One of the things that I always found like you would always run into in doing these studies is that there was like the ingredient that does a great job, and then it like gets incorporated into all this other stuff that's like garbage or like kind of messes up the like it's hard to just do research on like one ingredient because really they go into the entire food supply and the whole food system and the product. How do you like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, allulose is great, and then we're going to put it into like a Snickers bar, or you know what I mean? Like how do you think about that? Like, as you know, somebody who works with food formulators, like how are you thinking about that piece?
Right. Well, Sally, so please appreciate, of course, that I'm just the biomedical scientist and not on your end. But I've become more familiar with that. So just as a simple and funny example of what you're talking about, stevia, I think, is a wonderful sweetener. And talk about high intense sweetener. I mean, stevia really goes a long way. And because it is so high intense, it's almost impossible to find a powdered stevia without pure dextrose or glucose as a filler. So people are ripping open that little packet of stevia, putting it in their coffee, thinking very proudly of themselves that I'm not going to have any glycemic effect. And then they see this glycemic effect. Well, it's not the stevia, it's all the dextrose that was put in there. So the blessing and the curse of allulose perhaps is that because it has a relatively lower sweetener than sugar, it is used at generally normal amounts. So you don't need to load it with a filler or a flow agent to get it to move well. It can be just pure allulose. But it is going to find its way into more and more products. Indeed, it already is in some, like certain yogurts. I think Chobani has an allulose-based yogurt now. And then Hershey's is experimenting now with using allulose in some of theirs. So time will tell how it is used. My only thought on this is that it will likely come last in liquid because it is relatively lower on the sweetener scale. You need relatively more of it, and particularly that seems to get diluted in water very quickly. And so you'd need quite a bit of allulose to sweeten a given volume of water, like in a soda pop, which, as the dose goes higher and higher, the potential for a little GI distress goes higher and higher as well. So its feasibility is being already proven in that it is already in these more complex products that have hit market, like Chobani and like RxSugar, which is a company whose all of its treats and sweets are based purely on allulose. But it will be important to monitor what it gets mixed with, no doubt.
Thank you.
Great. So I will move on to our second speaker, Alexi Melvin. She's a diabetes expert and Beyond Type 1 board member. I believe she's been in the space for over a decade. And she's also the Chief Alliances Officer at Nutritious Brands, where she spearheads the alliances and partnerships within their strongest resonating communities who are managing chronic diseases. Diabetes would be one. I also want to congratulate Alexi on winning the 2024 award for outstanding choreography for her co-production of, is it Illinois? How do you pronounce that, Alexi?
Illinois, yeah.
Illinois, great. So I think you're our first Tony winner that I know of you had as a speaker. So thank you very much. And why don't you go ahead and give us, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Yeah, like you said, I'm the Chief Alliances Officer at Nutritious Brands, which is RxSugar. Those are the products that we offer, which are allulose. And I have type 1 diabetes myself. I've been with the company for a while now, since it came about, and I can definitely speak to the benefits of the products. So yeah, I can just kind of show a little bit about who we are. Let's see here. Okay. Awesome. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's see, here is, yeah. I'll get back to the beginning here. So yeah, here's a little bit about who we are. Founded in 2019. We like to think of ourselves as a health and wellness company disguised as a food company, based on our prime directive, which is to solve for sugar, which is one of the leaders in chronic illness, as we know. We offer fully functional plant-based syrups, chocolate snacks, other things, which you'll see, specifically formulated for blood glucose control, which I can speak to for sure, organic, non-GMO. And as you'll see, we partner with many health and wellness nonprofits and companies and organizations, which is essentially what I do. And then here you can see some of our product lineup there, as well as all of the formal certifications, which, you know, keto, organic, non-GMO, vegan, the list goes on and on. So we're very proud of that. These are our chocolate swelthy snacks, sweet and healthy. These are amazing. These are probably my favorite. I will have one of these before or after a meal, and I can see a significant change in my blood sugar control, which, you know, I have a continuous glucose monitor and it's just a flat line. So, and then we have these syrups that are amazing. You can use them in coffee. There's the chocolate syrup. So those have been around for a bit now. And then these are fun. These are kind of like pixie sticks, if you remember those, but no blood sugar impact, which is super fun. And then our newest here is our brownie mix. Again, no blood sugar spike. It's microwave for 45 seconds and there it is. So we're very excited about that as well. And yeah, and then here you can see some of our incredible health and wellness partnerships that I have had the pleasure of working with. Most notably JDRF, Beyond Type 1. Those are some of our very first organizations that are type 1 diabetes, you know, organizations. And we've, you know, we try to support these groups in, you know, whatever they're doing, whether it be like a, you know, a walk or a virtual initiative of some kind, you know, or some kind of creative thing they want to do on social media. We, you know, anything we can do to sort of get our products to these people who could really benefit from it. As you know, as you can see, also Crohn's and colitis, Kidney Foundation, celiac disease, you know, there's, the list goes on and on. I could talk about it all day. Diabetes Sports Project, all these amazing athletes with diabetes, Parkinson's Foundation. Yeah, it's been great. And it's really, really special to offer these products to them. And then you can see some of where you can find us. Yeah, that's really about it for me. I just wanted to share, how special our products are, and happy to answer questions, but yeah, that's about it for me.
So at the beginning of the year, when we did a overview of trends that people had questions for, and one of the real questions people had was, hey, the packaged good companies are seeing a real drop in sales. What can one do to, what trends are there out there to help them combat that? So this was, I think, soon after I became aware of all of this. So what questions do folks have? Go ahead, Gina.
Yeah, first, quick one. You said these are plant-based. Ben had mentioned figs, I think corn. How do you synthesize your allulose? Is it a range of different plant products, or is it focused on one that you found to be the greatest yield for the effort?
Yeah, I think maybe.
So.
Yeah. I think maybe Neil, if you could jump in on this one.
Yeah,
and introduce yourself, Neil.
Yeah, Neil, please.
Of course, thanks, Lucille. So hi, everyone. My name is Neil. I spent 20 years in the tech industry, 12 at Google before realizing, actually helping to build Google Maps and their platform products before realizing we've done pretty well in digitizing the world's maps. And I realized through the chronic kind of conditions of many friends and families that the world of metabolic health needed some help. So I decided to switched to the metabolic health world. Couldn't be happier. I've been with RxSugar for about 3 months now. So I joined as their chief business officer. To answer your question, we currently use organic non-GMO corn as effectively as the base, and then an enzyme process to extract that. So I believe we are one of the only organic non-GMO allulose providers out there. And maybe just while I'm speaking, Sally, to connect this back to your previous question. So obviously, as you heard Alexi in the overview, we really focus on minimal 100% natural products specifically designed for blood sugar control and in satiety. So the company, I kind of think of ourselves as the Tesla circa 2005, when we're all about kind of the electric car experience. So we want to give the best of the best from a metabolic health perspective in our products. Obviously, there are many other partnerships out there utilizing allulose within other products. I think that still potential has some benefits and viability if you consider the glycemic control properties that Ben talked about. That even with others, it provides a dampening response. But we firmly believe that the most minimal pure products are the best. And all of the clinical studies and research that we do obviously are utilizing pure allulose. And many of our products are just, the pure allulose, or with the chocolate bars and keto brownies, there's maybe 4 or 5 other ingredients in there, all, natural and all organic and non-GMO.
Go ahead. We can also do a roundtable discussion. We don't, calling on folks. So what advice do you guys have for the company? What do you have? What do you think? This is sometimes the case study can be a very helpful format. And add in additional questions if you have. Go ahead. You don't have to raise your hand, Gina. Just go ahead.
One of the things that seems rather alarming about the GLP-1s, I guess, Ozempic, Wegovy, is they seem to be being consumed more and more by children. And you just think, wow, now you've got someone taking this who's maybe 10 years old or 11 years old. And I don't know, Ben, what your studies have probably been. Well, you've said rats, rodents. A lot of the studies end up being in adults first, or adult product, but diabetes starts very young. So perhaps maybe a lot of the studies have been on children, but I'm just wondering both the allulose in children, and then for Neil and for Lexi, is that a particular market where there might be a better answer for parents who are looking for some help on obesity?
Yeah, by way of using the drugs in children, I'm very troubled by it. The part of the there's one study that was published that looked at one of these early GLP-1 agonists. It has not been repeated with semaglutide, which is the currently predominantly used GLP-1 drug. This was used, it was based on liraglutide, which is still used, and there's reason to expect semaglutide has the same effect. But one of the mechanisms of action of improving insulin resistance is that it may be activating something called adipocyte hyperplasia. So there's this paradox when it comes to obesity and insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, which is the body that can get the fattest, because it can continue to multiply its fat cells, will have more fat cells, but smaller. And that's why they can get fat. And yet it's the size of the fat cell that determines insulin resistance and associated obesity pathologies. It's not the amount of fat per se. This is reflected even across the sexes. Why can a woman have a higher body fat than her male counterpart and be metabolically healthier? It's because she makes more fat cells than he does, and that's very heavily driven by sex hormones. But certain ethnicities have this too. Why can a Caucasian be much fatter than his Chinese male counterpart? Like in Singapore, they both gain 10 pounds. The Chinese man, Singaporean, has profound fatty liver disease, hypertension, whereas the slightly chubbier Caucasian is just a little chubbier and doesn't look as good in his Speedo. So one of the mechanisms whereby these GLP-1 agonists may improve metabolic health is paradoxically by increasing the number of fat cells. Now, you're logically thinking, well, but Ben, we know when people get on these drugs, they're getting leaner. They are. You can make more fat cells and still have the general size of the fat cells being small, because they're not eating anymore. But it does suggest a pending storm where the bill comes due. And when the inevitable arrives that these kids either get off the drug because they're so sick of feeling sick, or it's affecting their development in ways that we don't even know yet, or the cravings just start to come back. A whole line of evidence I didn't show you is based on the fact that even at these high doses, the dose becomes increasingly less effective. And what was an immediate reduction in cravings 6 months in becomes a total return to cravings at 24 months. So these kids, I suspect, will just outgrow the dose, even if they don't get off it. And then now, if we put them in a position to end up even heavier than they were before, without ever having learned the mental discipline that you must develop in order to just say, no, I'm not going to eat that. The artificial discipline that the drug gives only lasts as long as the drug is in the system. And then the person actually hasn't developed the fortitude or the coping skills to look at something they know they shouldn't eat and actually put it to the side. So I am very worried about putting kids on these drugs. And like I said, I suspect all we've done is kick the problem down the road, and in the process, it's just getting bigger and bigger.
So, Ben, just a question as you talk about that, for what sounds like a bit of a ticking time bomb, whether it's adults or children, what do you see if you were to fast forward 5 years, 3 years, 10 years? Like, what do you see as happening to the population that has been raised on these drugs or has kind of come back to them on these cycles and seesaws of coming off, regaining the weight, losing the muscle mass, the bone density, and then returning to the drug?
Yeah. Well, Natasha, it won't surprise you to hear that it's pretty doom and gloom, for the reasons I mentioned, but even further, I imagine the child whose fat mass can grow, but whose lean mass is compromised. I imagine the little girl whose digestion is so compromised, she's not eating enough iron for normal menstrual cycles, and she becomes iron deficient and develops a profound anemia very quickly. Or the little boy who's not able to absorb enough fats to produce enough testosterone. We know that when males go on a low-fat diet, their testosterone production drops. So the consequences of this very quickly start to spin out of control and go well beyond the metabolic. As much as with the best of intentions, we're trying to help these kids be lean without having to learn the life skills necessary to do it. We cannot expect, unfortunately, it does not stay confined to the metabolic, and we are depriving the child of learning life lessons. Like I said, we're also giving the parents an out. And so much of childhood obesity is dependent on the parents. And I'm a parent. I'm very sensitive to the challenges of parenting, and where kids are eating and what they're doing when they're not at home. But we can't, maybe a deeper issue, and I know I've stopped answering the question, Natasha, so pardon me, but I don't like this tendency to deny the reality of consequences. That a part of me worries that, are we just continuing to foster a culture where we can tell someone, do whatever you want, and just take this injection, just take this pill, and it'll undo everything, all of your bad choices. I think I have to reject that idea that there must be part of growing up is learning to appreciate the consequences of your decision, even nutritionally, and certainly well beyond that. I mean, I want my kids to learn that a bad choice of crossing the street in the dark, that's a dumb decision with a potentially horrible consequence. But so too, I want them to learn, I want to have a healthy, strong body when I get older. And so I need to have certain habits now. What lesson are we teaching children if we're basically depriving them of any opportunity, to learn discipline and to learn the reality of consequences for better and worse? So anyway, Natasha, yeah, sorry. So I'm very, very worried. I'm very skeptical, not only in adults, but these kids who are developing, we don't have any data. What does happen to bone mass if a child goes through puberty on a GLP-1 receptor agonist? What happens to gonadal development in the boy who perhaps has deprived lower levels of testosterone production? I don't know, but it's not going to be good.
Thanks for the great question, Natasha. Gina, maybe just to add my context. So obviously, as a father, it's something that deeply concerns me as well. And Ben can give me marks for my biochemistry, but one of the things that amazes me still is within the roughly 6 liters of blood within, of course, an adult human, we can only tolerate 1 teaspoonful of sugar or blood glucose before, as Ben explained, insulin effectively needs to rapidly get that out of the bloodstream, because any more of that is toxic for us. And we've evolved from that perspective. So I always think back to that, and then you think of the foods that everyone was eating, and any sugar or carbohydrate is going to elicit that response. So therefore, anything we can do to help control blood sugar is going to help kind of over time. So I think there's a huge education, obviously, piece needed here. As a company, we are actually looking actively now for pilots to run with schools specifically around this. I can just talk from my own personal experience, because after coming across RxSugar, I rigorously tested the product, myself, to test all of the clinical trials and results that kind of Ben has looked. And I now actually give my daughter an RxSugar bar to take to school every day as an insurance policy against a school lunch, because I know it's going to help her manage the glycemic response of what they put in the schools. But we would love to do more with schools to help on the education piece. But really, RxSugar, we're trying to translate the science into natural, practical products. That means that kids don't get to miss out on the sweet treats, but they're actually having a sweet treat that can help manage and control their blood sugar and not compound the problem. So we believe we can be a really effective toolkit to help parents and children again manage and not have to rely on the synthetic drugs, which especially in children have a lot of concern, as Ben mentioned.
Thank you.
I will say, just from a like raw material food ingredient supply, I will say that I'm no longer working in the stevia world, but like at the time, we were going to customers, and the issue was like not even being able to get supply of allulose. So, it's kind of a bottleneck. And I will say, the last half of my career has been in the world of novel food ingredients. So, things that have just been approved. And I mean, the uptake of allulose has been pretty impressive. I would say it's one of the few new ingredients that is really taking off. And so it's great to actually see this research, because it's hard. I mean, one of the things that's I think is a little tricky from a consumer standpoint that feels a little odd is that those like the sugars are not counted on the label, and you have like tagatose out there where it's like, yes, you have to count those, but like allulose, you don't. And so I think there is this little part of me that's sort of like, is this real, you know? Like, so I think, you know, it's still new. It's heartening to hear the research that's happening. And I think just, you know, from my perspective, like I would just, you know, encourage like looking at the full food formulation, because I think that that's the hard thing. It's like, it's one thing to test the ingredient just as a single. It's another thing when it's in a total diet. And, you know, just making sure that like those results are translatable across like packet with just allulose in it versus allulose in this like whole other food system. And what are those full impacts? And I think we're still kind of like working towards seeing that. I think, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a scientist either, I'm a marketer. But
Yeah,
it's
no, thanks, Ali.
like,
Yeah.
I definitely think it's cool. Like, and I loved seeing all that stuff, Ben, because I hadn't seen that before. So that's pretty exciting, that research.
It's more of a question. Can you overdose on allulose? If people think, oh, this is good for me, and they just start, I'm gonna put that in everything, or I'll just have this
Yeah.
6 times a day, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Can
I'm
you
gonna have
Yeah.
all those bars.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
the
And
nice
then
thing about allulose is
Yeah.
because it does have a finite absorption, if you
Yeah.
overdose, your belly will tell you.
Okay.
And so there's no truly kind of harmful consequence of so-called overdose. It would just be you're gonna want to stay home for a little bit to get that
Like
out of your
eating too many
system.
prunes, you can't be careful.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
The other thing I would add to that, and I've just been at the American Diabetes Association conference for the last 2-3 days, you know, speaking to a lot of people who use allulose and RxSugar, just speaking to the industry in general. But I always will say to advents, because it naturally stimulates GLP-1 and it increases satiety, you also don't get the feeling or need, or certainly my personal experience and everything that we hear back from customers is you actually have 1, maybe maximum 2 of the chocolate bars. Alexi can speak to this. I always look to my own experience. You actually don't need any more. You have the sweet taste, but you also have the satiety as well. So I thought it's also, I think there's an element of, I don't want to say self-regulation within allulose because everything's personal, but because of that, and, you know, obviously sugar and carbohydrates are, again, they're utilizing the fructose pathway in the body, which is, you know, kind of from an evolutionary perspective, obviously a very interesting pathway that has saved us as a species. I know Dr. Richard Johnson has done a huge amount of work on this. So that's why I also just think, you know, it is a really interesting tool to have out there. And because of that, then I've not heard one single customer or user that's come back and said, I ate 1, I ate 5 because, you know, I couldn't stop. It's I ate 1, it was great, or maybe I had 2 and then I didn't need any more.
Just as an aside, when I lived in the UK, there's a rather famous case, Sunny Delight hit the shelves, and kids love it, and it's just like orange juice, only better. And the kids are drinking so much of it, they started turning orange because there's a huge amount of beta carotene in it.
Yeah.
And parents go, oh my gosh, my kid's sick. And it was a big problem for P&G for a while. It really dented the product. They had to pull it off the shelves.
Yes.
And people are like, what's in this stuff? What is it actually? Oh, it's not orange juice, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't think someone's going to overconsume something to that amount, but sometimes they do. Anyway.
And
Very true.
building on that, after what you'd said, Ben, about the negative side effect profiles from the GLP-1 incretins, could you are we not seeing those with allulose, or what is the overlap? Is it basically that you stop and you don't have it for part of the day, and then your stomach contents move? That
Yeah. Well, we definitely don't see a loss of lean mass. In our rodent study and in the human study we've started, I'm unaware of any report that's documented a loss of lean mass. And I suspect that's largely because you can't force your intestines to make a level of GLP-1 that would be harmful. Whereas these injectables are dialing it up to an 11, it is taking that GLP-1 pathway, that signaling pathway, and turning it up to a point that you could never reach endogenously or on your own. All allulose is doing is just telling the intestines, hey, let's just make more. So it's still very much in a physiological range, which I don't believe could ever become overtly pathogenic. I don't think you could jack your own GLP-1 up high enough to have some of those effects, but no report has documented this. Even the old human stuff from Korea and Japan, the longest areas where the human research has been happening, I'm unaware of any study, and I'm aware of a lot of them that have documented any of these kinds of effects.
Thank you.
And maybe just one thing quick, Steele, just sally back to I would say your previous question. So I think the economies of scale back a few years ago, allulose was and still is more expensive than sugar and the others. So I would say particularly to that point, we are obviously as a startup, we're working on a fundraising round right now, where if we're successful in that, I think we can dramatically improve the kind of unit economics because we would like allulose to be much more available and on a cost parity to others. So it's also obviously just a shout out there. If any of you kind of are interested or have networks that are interested, we are going through our startups always continually fundraising, but we're going through an active fundraising round right now. So please reach out.
So are you guys producer? You are allulose producers? You're like producing.
So we are currently not, but through the round of funding, if we're successful in that, then we will become vertically integrated to manufacture in the US our own allulose. So there is an environmental impact of this because again, we'll be manufacturing this, and obviously sugarcane and the other alternatives are causing a huge amount of environmental kind of destruction and devastation. So there is an interesting environmental angle to this, but also we would then be manufacturing in the US, and we would be fully vertically integrated, which we think is a very compelling opportunity, given allulose is currently 0.002% of the entire $120 billion sugar and sweetener market. So there's just a huge amount of of potential both, and we would love to be both a direct to consumer brand, but we also want to be a B2B ingredient powerhouse. We do want allulose to be available to anyone who wants to include it within their products within cost-effective units, because we believe that glycemic control properties and all of the other metabolic health benefits are better than any other option out there for those who would like to include something sweet within their product range.
So as we're coming up, we've gone a fair bit over. Does anyone have any last questions before we sign off and thank Ben, Alexi, and Neil? Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Super interesting.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.